In the long record of fallen nations, collapse usually arrives with noise. Cannons thunder, soldiers march, cities burn. Empires tend to die loudly. But in the 19th century, the most powerful empire in the Middle East unraveled in near silence. No battlefield decided its fate. No foreign army stormed its capital. Instead, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled line by line, ledger by ledger, by men in suits who never fired a shot. Its defeat came not from gunpowder, but from compound interest, and that quiet method of conquest would prove far more effective than any invasion. This was the first modern debt trap, not a metaphor, not a theory, a real working system that transferred power without borders ever changing on a map. For centuries, the Ottoman state had terrified Europe. Now Europe would hollow it out from the inside. And the lesson is uncomfortable because it reveals something brutal about power. You don't need to occupy a country to control it. You just need to own what it owes. And at the time, almost no one saw it coming. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked immense. Its territory stretched from the Balkans across Anatolia, down through the Levant and across North Africa. It guarded Mecca and Medina. It controlled the Bosphorus, the choke point between continents. The Sultan ruled millions and sat at the crossroads of global trade. On paper, this was still a superpower, but appearances were doing most of the work. Underneath the surface, the structure was cracking, and the cracks were spreading fast. While Britain and France were racing through the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman economy was stuck in another era. European factories ran on steam and steel. Ottoman production relied on hand tools and animals. The empire was overwhelmingly rural, built on small farms and traditional crafts that couldn't compete with machine-made imports flooding in from the West. Cheap European goods destroyed local workshops, trade deficits grew, cash drained out, and the state treasury was always empty. The tax system made everything worse. It depended on local officials who skimmed revenue before it reached Istanbul. Entire regions paid only a fraction of what they owed. Corruption wasn't a side effect, it was baked in. For centuries, the empire survived this way. When money ran short, the state debased its coins or seized the fortunes of disgraced elites. Those tricks had worked in a pre-industrial world, but now they barely moved the needle, and the bills kept coming. The Ottomans knew what they needed. They needed a modern army to deter Russia. They needed roads, ports, telegraphs, and rail lines. They needed to look like a European power because European powers preyed on weakness. But modernization required capital, and capital was exactly what they lacked. For decades, Ottoman rulers resisted borrowing from the West. Charging interest clashed with religious norms. Political dependence was feared even more. Once you borrowed, leverage shifted, and that risk felt existential. Then came 1853. Russian forces crossed into Ottoman territory, igniting the Crimean War. This was not a small border clash. It was a full-scale confrontation that threatened the empire's survival. Britain and France joined the fight, not out of love for the Ottomans, but out of fear of Russian expansion. Their fleets sailed into the Black Sea. Their troops landed on Ottoman soil, but they brought something else with them, too. Bankers. War is expensive. The Ottoman treasury was bleeding gold it didn't have. Soldiers needed pay, weapons needed steel, ships needed supplies. Sultan Abdul-Majid was cornered. His advisors told him the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Without foreign money, the war would be lost. Tradition had to give way to survival. In 1854, the empire crossed a line it had avoided for centuries. It took its first foreign loan, and nothing would ever be the same. The agreement was framed as help from allies. In reality, it was a business deal written for bankers, not states. British and French financiers issued bonds at deep discounts. For every £100 of debt the Ottomans signed for, they received only 80 in cash. The rest vanished as fees and commissions. But interest was charged on the full amount. From the very beginning, the math was stacked against them. They owed more than they received, and the clock started ticking immediately.
Still, when the gold arrived in Istanbul, it felt like salvation. Troops were paid, supplies moved, the front held. And when the Crimean War ended in 1856 with Russia checked, the Sultan felt something dangerous. Relief mixed with confidence. The empire had survived. More than that, it had found a new lever of power. With a signature in London or Paris, money appeared. No new taxes, no riots, no reforms, just ink on paper. That discovery changed everything. The war was over, but the borrowing didn't stop. Ottoman leaders had tasted easy credit, and they wanted more. They looked west and saw cities glowing under gaslights, lined with opera houses, boulevards, and monuments. Compared to Paris or London, Istanbul suddenly felt old, even backward. European diplomats whispered about the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman elite took it personally. They wanted proof, visible proof, that the empire still belonged among the great powers. So the spending began, not on factories, not on schools, not on systems that would eventually pay for themselves. The money went to image, to spectacle, to symbols meant to silence critics and impress rivals. Nothing captured that mindset better than the decision to abandon Topkapi Palace. For 4 centuries, sultans had ruled from its courtyards. But Sultan Abdul-Majid wanted something different, something European, something overwhelming. He wanted a palace that screamed modern power. The result was Dolmabahce Palace, rising along the Bosphorus like a dream carved from debt. It was enormous, lavish, and unapologetic. Gold leaf coated the ceilings, Italian marble lined the halls, silk carpets covered the floors. A massive crystal chandelier, still one of the largest ever made, hung above the central hall, a gift from Queen Victoria herself. Baccarat crystal formed the staircase. Every detail was meant to rival Versailles, and every detail was paid for with borrowed money. The price was staggering. Roughly 5 million Ottoman gold lira, about a quarter of the empire's entire annual tax income, went into that single building. While peasants across Anatolia struggled with wooden plows and dry soil, crystal arrived from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a home the state could not afford. And Dolmabahce was only the beginning. Each new project meant another trip to the bankers. 1855, 1858, 1860. Loan followed loan. European financiers were happy to oblige. The interest rates were high, the fees were enormous, and there was a comforting assumption behind every deal. The Ottoman Empire was too important to fail. Britain and France wouldn't let it collapse because geography alone made it indispensable. That belief changed behavior. Bankers took bigger risks, knowing governments would step in if things went wrong. This is moral hazard in its purest form, and it encouraged reckless lending on both sides. By the 1860s, the system was breaking down. The empire wasn't earning enough to cover its interest payments, let alone the principal. So new loans were taken out to service old ones. Debt was being used to pay debt. Nothing productive was being built. No growth engine existed. The numbers looked fine, only because no one wanted to stop the music. But the hole was getting deeper, and the exit was disappearing. The burden showed up clearly in the budget. Around 1860, roughly 15% of state income went toward debt service. 10 years later, it was more than half. That meant every fisherman, every farmer, every merchant was effectively working for foreign creditors. Money entered the treasury and left the country almost instantly. There was nothing left to fund the army, the navy, schools, or roads. The empire still existed, but its core functions were starving, and this was just the beginning. To survive day to day, the government turned to short-term borrowing at home. In Istanbul's Galata district lived powerful Greek and Armenian financiers who specialized in emergency loans. When the treasury ran dry before the next European bond issue, officials went to them. The rates were brutal, 18%, 20%, sometimes more. It was financial triage that guaranteed long-term damage. But the state had no choice, or at least it believed it didn't. In 1861, Sultan Abdul Aziz took the throne. Where his predecessor favored palaces, Abdulaziz favored power, especially military power. He was obsessed with hardware. He wanted ships, guns, armor. He looked at the British Royal Navy and decided the Ottomans needed one just as impressive. Orders went out to British shipyards. Ironclad warships were built and delivered. German cannons were purchased. On paper, the Ottoman Navy became the third largest in the world. But paper strength hides real weakness. The empire couldn't afford coal to fuel the ships. It couldn't afford maintenance. Crews went unpaid. The fleet sat anchored in the Golden Horn, rusting, floating monuments to debt. Each vessel represented prestige bought on credit, power that existed only in theory. And behind the scenes, the numbers kept getting worse. No reform arrived, no reset happened. The system lurched forward, unstable and overextended. Then the world changed. In 1873, a financial panic erupted in Vienna. Banks collapsed. Credit froze. What followed was a global downturn known as the Long Depression.
Capital retreated everywhere. European lenders suddenly had their own problems to deal with. Risk tolerance vanished overnight. New loans dried up. And at the exact moment the money stopped flowing, disaster struck at home. An unforgiving drought hit Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Harvests failed, livestock died. Entire regions faced famine. The peasants who formed the backbone of the tax system had nothing left to give. Tax collectors returned empty-handed, reporting villages of dust and graves. Revenue collapsed. But the debt schedule didn't care about drought. Payments were still due, interest still accrued, and the treasury was empty. By 1875, reality could no longer be avoided. Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha studied the accounts and saw the truth. There was a massive payment due to European bondholders in October. There was no money. He tried to raise a new loan. The markets were closed. No one would lend. The empire faced an impossible choice: drain the last food from starving provinces to pay bankers, or stop paying altogether. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Ramadan. It announced that debt payments would be cut in half. 50% would be paid in cash, the rest would be replaced with paper promises bearing interest. In diplomatic language, it was called a temporary adjustment. In financial reality, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire was bankrupt, and the shockwaves were immediate. The reaction across Europe was explosive. Ottoman bonds had been marketed to ordinary investors as safe, high-yield opportunities backed by an ancient empire. Teachers, shopkeepers, widows, millions had poured their savings into them. Overnight, those investments were gutted. Newspapers in London and Paris went into a frenzy. Editorials accused the Ottomans of fraud and betrayal. Sympathy vanished, political goodwill evaporated. And just like that, the diplomatic shield that had protected the empire from Russia cracked wide open. Financial weakness is an invitation. The Russian Empire saw it immediately. The Ottomans were broke, isolated, and unstable. In 1877, Russia declared war. What followed was brutal. Ottoman soldiers fought hard, but morale was low, pay was irregular, supplies were scarce, leadership was divided. Russian forces pushed deep into Ottoman territory, advancing all the way to the outskirts of Istanbul. From the hills, they could see the minarets of Hagia Sophia. The empire was on its knees. The peace that followed was humiliating. Vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus were stripped away. But land wasn't the worst part. Russia imposed a crushing war indemnity, over 800 million francs. It was punishment disguised as accounting. Now the Ottomans owed massive sums to British and French creditors they had already defaulted on, plus an enormous new obligation to Russia. The total debt exceeded the entire productive capacity of the state. Insolvency wasn't a phase anymore, it was permanent. Sultan Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne amid this wreckage. He ruled an empire that still existed on maps, but not in reality. Credit was gone, territory was lost, the army was weakened. Everyone expected the European powers to carve the Ottomans apart, but Britain and France chose a different path. Direct conquest was expensive, administration was messy, occupation bred resistance. There was a cleaner option: control the money, control the state.
In 1881, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They weren't soldiers. They didn't threaten invasion. They brought documents. They demanded guarantees. Negotiations followed, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Ottomans had no leverage. That December, the Decree of Muharrem was issued. It reshaped the empire without firing a shot. It created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an institution unlike anything that had existed before. The OPDA wasn't part of the Ottoman government. It was a foreign-run corporation with extraordinary powers. Its board represented banks from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. Its headquarters rose over Istanbul like a fortress of paperwork. And under the decree, the empire surrendered its most reliable revenue streams. Taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, fishing, spirits, and legal documents were handed over completely. The Sultan admitted in writing that his own state could not be trusted to collect its own taxes. The OPDA built a bureaucracy that rivaled the state itself. Thousands of uniformed tax collectors were hired. They carried weapons. They answered to European directors, not Ottoman officials. They spread across the empire, from Balkan villages to Levantine ports. Every transaction they touched sent money abroad. Catch a fish, pay London. Harvest silk, pay Paris. Buy salt, pay Berlin. The empire still had a ruler, but its cash flow was gone. Ironically, the OPDA worked well. It modernized collection systems. It reduced corruption. It even invested in productivity, improving salt mines, stabilizing silk production, upgrading storage. But the benefits flowed outward. Between 1881 and 1914, roughly one-third of all Ottoman revenue went straight to foreign creditors. The government was left with the remainder to run an empire, maintain an army, and fund basic services. It was never enough. Development stalled. Poverty hardened. Dependence became permanent. Sovereignty eroded quietly. If the Sultan wanted a school, he needed permission. A road required approval. Most requests were denied. And the debt trap did more than drain money. It shaped policy. Foreign influence seeped into diplomacy, defense, and strategy. That opened the door for a new power with bigger ambitions, Germany. Unlike Britain and France, Germany wasn't content to collect interest. Kaiser Wilhelm II courted the Ottomans aggressively. He visited Istanbul. He flattered the Sultan. He framed Britain and France as parasites and Germany as a partner. Then he offered a vision, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Steel linking Europe to the Middle East, bypassing British-controlled sea lanes. For the Ottomans, it sounded like salvation, mobility, modernization, alliance. Germany financed the project through Deutsche Bank. The terms were ruthless. The empire guaranteed profits per kilometer, regardless of usage. Worse, German companies gained rights to minerals and oil along the route. Control shifted again. By 1910, German officers trained Ottoman troops. German engineers ran infrastructure. German banks held new debt. Britain and France watched their grip loosen, and tensions across Europe tightened. When World War I erupted, Ottoman leaders made a desperate gamble. If Germany won, debts to Britain and France could be erased, the OPDA could be dismantled, financial independence could return. They joined the war. One of their first acts was expelling foreign directors from the OPDA and halting payments. For a moment, it felt like freedom. Then the war collapsed around them. The empire was destroyed, but the debt survived. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey emerged under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Europe returned with ledgers in hand. Turkey was told it had inherited the land and the mortgage. Reluctantly, it agreed. Payments continued for decades. The final installment was made on May 25, 1954. 100 years after the first loan, the last bill was paid. The Ottomans didn't fall to age or invasion. They were foreclosed. And the warning they left behind is clear. Power isn't just about armies or borders. It's about solvency. If you don't control your debt controls you.